This book is not in most Bibles. It describes angels who deliberately descended to earth. It explains exactly why the ancient world had to be violently and entirely destroyed. And for centuries, it was meticulously, intentionally removed from the public eye. Why was it excluded from the sacred canon? What exactly did it describe that was so deeply unsettling to early scholars and theologians? Who were the enigmatic entities it calls the Watchers? And most importantly, what truly existed on this planet in the dark, forgotten eras before the Great Flood wiped the slate clean? If even half of what this ancient text claims is true, the pre-flood world was absolutely nothing like we imagine. We are heavily conditioned to view the dawn of human history through a comfortable, sanitized lens. We picture early humanity wrapped in rough animal skins, living simple, quiet, and ignorant lives in the dust, slowly and painfully figuring out how to strike stones together to create fire. We imagine the time before the Great Flood as a quiet, primitive, and technologically dark landscape. But there is a text, a forbidden, profoundly disturbing manuscript that completely shatters that comfortable illusion. It paints a terrifyingly different picture of human origins. It speaks of a civilization that advanced far too quickly. It speaks of a world completely corrupted by advanced knowledge it was never ever meant to possess. A world where the absolute sacred boundaries between the human dimension and the divine realm were violently and irreversibly shattered. This is not a modern science fiction story about ancient aliens. This is not a fabricated internet myth born in the dark corners of the web. This is one of the oldest, most profound, and highly controversial religious texts ever discovered. A text that attempts to explain the very origin of absolute, systemic evil on earth. Before we explore the terrifying narrative of falling angels, the transfer of forbidden technology, and the massive hybrids that allegedly walk the earth, we must firmly establish the historical ground we are standing on. To truly understand the dark, crushing gravity of the Book of Enoch, you must completely forget the internet conspiracies. You must look directly at the cold, hard, undeniable archaeological record. You need to know that the texts we are examining possessed massive, undeniable historical authority in the ancient world. For over 1,000 long dark years, the complete manuscript of this text was considered entirely lost to the Western world. It was a theological ghost, a highly controversial, shadowy text mentioned only in fearful whispers by the early Christian church fathers. Brilliant early theologians heavily reference the Book of Enoch to explain the dark origins of demonic entities and the rampant, systemic evil of the ancient world. It was even quoted briefly but explicitly in the canonical Book of Jude in the New Testament. The early believers did not reject this text. They read it, they fiercely debated it, and they deeply respected it. But as the centuries passed, the early councils gathered behind closed doors. The official, rigid boundaries of the biblical canon were systematically drawn. And the Book of Enoch, with its terrifyingly detailed, incredibly vivid accounts of rogue angels and cosmic judgments, was ultimately deemed too dangerous, too controversial, and too deeply unsettling. It was quietly pushed into the shadows, excluded, hidden. European theologians and academic scholars firmly believed that every single manuscript copy had been entirely destroyed, erased from human existence by the strict censorship of ancient authorities. But it was not destroyed. It was being carefully, meticulously preserved. thousands of miles away from the fierce theological and political debates of Rome, deep in the isolated, highly mountainous, and fiercely independent highlands of Africa, the ancient text survived. The Ethiopian Orthodox Church, operating in deep, impenetrable isolation, had kept the ancient book perfectly intact. They did not consider it a dangerous text to be locked away in a dark vault. They considered it sacred, authoritative scripture, fully integrating it into their official canon. Written in the ancient liturgical language of Ge'ez, the Ethiopian manuscripts quietly held the terrifying secrets of the pre-flood world. When the Scottish explorer James Bruce finally navigated the treacherous African continent and brought complete, beautifully preserved copies back to Europe in the year 1773, the academic world was completely shaken to its core. But skeptical historians still doubted. They questioned its true age, suggesting it might be a later medieval forgery. The ultimate, absolute, and undeniable historical validation came decades later from the burning, desolate sands of the Judean desert. In the freezing winter of 1947, wandering Bedouin shepherds made the Hoinai's greatest archaeological discovery of the 20th century. In the desolate, scorching, and incredibly arid caves of Qumran, located near the dead, heavily salted waters of the Dead Sea, a young shepherd heard the sharp, unmistakable sound of shattering clay. Hidden deep inside ancient sealed jars were the legendary Dead Sea Scrolls. And right there, sitting silently in the suffocating darkness alongside the oldest known, universally accepted copies of Genesis and Isaiah, archaeologists painstakingly pieced together fragments of something else. They found multiple, heavily weathered, undeniably ancient scrolls of the Book of Enoch, written in its original Aramaic language. This was a staggering, monumental archaeological earthquake. It definitively proved that the Book of Enoch was actively read, highly respected, and deeply studied by the ancient Jewish communities living centuries before the birth of Christianity. This was authentic, highly sophisticated ancient literature. But who exactly was the alleged author of this mind-bending manuscript? To understand the immense authority of the text, you must look at the patriarch himself. According to the ancient, highly structured biblical genealogies recorded in the Book of Genesis, Enoch was an incredibly mysterious, almost ghostly figure. He was the 7th generation from Adam, the great-grandfather of Noah. The ancient Hebrew scripture dedicates only a few incredibly cryptic and deeply haunting sentences to his entire earthly existence. It states simply and profoundly that Enoch walked faithfully with God, and then he was no more, because God took him. He completely bypassed the biological finality of human death. He did not suffer the heavy decay of human flesh. He was abruptly, physically, and mysteriously extracted from the terrestrial plane. But the text bearing his name pulls back the heavy, impenetrable veil on what he actually witnessed before his mysterious departure. It positions Enoch not merely as a quiet, ancient nomad, but as a highly privileged cosmic scribe, a man taken deep into the heavenly realms to witness the terrifying, massive architecture of the cosmos, the dark, fiery prisons of fallen angels, and the devastating otherworldly rebellion that permanently corrupted the human timeline. According to the ancient text, the rapid, catastrophic downfall of the early human race did not begin with human rebellion. It did not begin with earthly politics, tribal warfare, or a simple mistake in a quiet garden. It began with a highly organized, cosmic treason. The Book of Enoch introduces a deeply complex, highly organized group of celestial beings. They are called the Watchers. According to ancient traditions, these were not hideous, deformed demons crawling up from the dark, suffocating abyss of hell. They were magnificent, highly intelligent, and incredibly powerful celestial entities originally assigned by the Creator to silently observe, guide, and carefully watch over the fragile, developing human race. They were the silent guardians of the ancient skies. They were supposed to watch. They were absolutely not supposed to interfere. But according to the terrifying narrative of Enoch, silent observation slowly, toxically mutated into a dangerous, highly unholy, and deeply obsessive fascination. The text states that 200 of these powerful watchers, stationed high above the earth, looked down upon the rapidly expanding human race. They saw the daughters of men, and they felt a dark, forbidden desire. But this was not a simple, spontaneous crime of passion or a fleeting moment of celestial weakness. It was a highly coordinated, heavily premeditated, and deliberate military rebellion against the absolute boundaries of the universe. The Book of Enoch explicitly names their supreme leader, a powerful, commanding, and deeply charismatic entity known as Semyaza. Semyaza knew perfectly well that crossing the absolute, heavily defined boundary between the immortal spirit realm and the fragile biological human realm was a catastrophic, unforgivable cosmic crime. The text records a chilling, highly psychological moment of dark hesitation. Semyaza looked at his heavily armed, brilliant celestial lieutenants and expressed a deep, paralyzing fear. He stated that he feared he alone would bear the crushing, devastating punishment for the great sin they were about to commit. But his generals, driven by blinding, unnatural lust and deep cosmic arrogance, refused to turn back. According to the manuscript, these 200 celestial beings descended physically onto the freezing, jagged, and snow-capped summit of Mount Hermon, a massive, towering peak located in the modern, heavily contested border area between Lebanon and Syria. On that freezing, windswept peak, standing far above the ignorant human settlements below, they made a terrifying, irreversible pact. They bound themselves together under a heavy, terrifying mutual curse, an unbreakable blood oath sworn in the thin mountain air. They deliberately chose to cross the ultimate, forbidden boundary, the infinite crashing violently into the finite, the spiritual forcefully merging with the biological. They descended into the valleys. They took human women as their wives. But the Book of Enoch reveals that the catastrophic corruption of the pre-flood world was not merely a matter of illicit physical union. The true, absolute horror unleashed by the Watchers was the highly unauthorized, aggressive transmission of forbidden knowledge. They did not just break the biological boundaries, they completely broke the technological and psychological boundaries of the human race. When the Watchers walked directly into the human camps, they did not come empty-handed. They brought the heavily guarded, forbidden secrets of the heavenly realm. It was an unauthorized, technological, and spiritual download that the human mind was completely, biologically unprepared to handle. According to the ancient text, these celestial beings systematically began to teach humanity secrets that were strictly meant to remain heavily veiled in the heavens. A prominent, incredibly dangerous watcher named Azazel taught men the highly complex, destructive art of metallurgy. He showed them exactly how to extract heavy metal from the earth. He taught them how to heat it, how to forge it, and how to sharpen it into lethal, deeply penetrating iron swords and bronze knives. He taught them how to craft heavy, impenetrable shields and breastplates. Before the violent descent of Azazel, human conflict was primitive. It was limited to heavy stones and crude wooden clubs. When Azazel taught the forging of swords, he did not just teach a simple mechanical skill. He fundamentally altered the human soul. He introduced the cold, calculated premeditation of murder. Azazel effectively handed the terrifying, bloody science of industrialized mass slaughter directly to a fragile, emotionally immature species. Men organized into violent legions. They built massive blazing forges and systematically mass-produced the heavy instruments of death. They learned to conquer, to subjugate, and to spill human blood on a scale that horrified the natural world. But the forbidden knowledge did not stop at heavy weaponry. The corruption systematically infected every facet of the human experience. Azazel also taught the women the dark, highly manipulative art of deception through cosmetics. The precise cutting of precious, sparkling stones, the beautifying of the eyelids, and the use of antimony. He intentionally introduced vanity, intense physical lust, and the aggressive psychological manipulation of seduction into the human psyche. They weaponized human beauty just as they had weaponized human aggression. Other fallen angels, named specifically in the text, taught humanity completely different, highly advanced disciplines. Semjaza taught the complex, highly dangerous casting of spells and the cutting of roots, introducing humanity to early pharmacology, mind-altering substances, and the dark arts of enchantment. Hermione taught the resolving of complex incantations. Barkayal taught the terrifying, highly mathematical science of astrology and the reading of the stars. Kokabel taught the omens of the constellations. Penemu taught humans the bitter and the sweet, and the use of ink and paper, which the text claims was a highly sophisticated technology intended to preserve deceit and manipulation across multiple generations. They handed the raw, unadulterated source code of the universe directly to easily corruptible human minds. Humanity was artificially, aggressively propelled forward by an alien intelligence. Observe the heavily connected, deeply technological era we currently inhabit. We are currently wrestling with the terrifying, razor-thin, ethical boundaries of artificial intelligence. We are quietly, nervously debating the dark implications of genetic engineering, the cloning of biological life, and the devastating power of nuclear weapons. We constantly, fearfully ask ourselves what exactly happens when humanity reaches for absolute, godlike knowledge it was never meant to possess. We worry deeply about technologies that outpace our moral evolution. The Book of Enoch states, with chilling, undeniable clarity, that this exact same crisis has already happened, thousands of years ago. The ancient world faced a terrifying technological singularity driven not by silicon microchips, but by the direct, forbidden intervention of celestial entities. The world before the flood was not primitive, it was corrupted. We were handed the matches while we were still standing in a room completely soaked in gasoline. The sudden, massive influx of celestial technology, dark magic, and highly sophisticated weaponry completely shattered the natural, intended progression of the human race. The ancient Earth was rapidly, violently transformed into a highly advanced, deeply sophisticated, and utterly ruthless global nightmare. But the unauthorized transfer of forbidden knowledge was only the very beginning of the horror. The absolute darkest, most terrifying consequence of the Watchers' descent was not what they taught the humans. It was what they created with them. The unnatural, forbidden physical union between the immortal, celestial Watchers and fragile biological human women produced a staggering anomaly. A biological abomination that completely violently defied the natural order established by the Creator. A terrifying, deeply unnatural consequence that would ultimately force the heavy hand of the heavens to completely reset the planet. According to the text, the women became pregnant, and they gave birth to the Nephilim. Modern pop culture constantly sanitizes these entities. We are heavily conditioned by modern religious stories to view giants merely as tall men, a slight biological anomaly, as mythical heroes of ancient folklore, or as misunderstood giants. The ancient traditions in the texts found in the Dead Sea caves offer absolutely no such comfort. They describe something far more terrifying. They describe massive, towering, incredibly violent apex predators. According to the text, they were hybrid abominations, a catastrophic blending of human DNA and angelic essence that was never meant to exist within the physical architecture of the earth. Beings of immense physical stature and insatiable, bottomless appetites. The Book of Enoch describes them as a highly destructive, parasitic force. As they grew in massive numbers and sheer physical size, their hunger became a heavy, suffocating burden on the human population. Initially, the human population desperately tried to sustain these massive hybrid offspring. But the text states that they quickly consumed all the acquisitions of men. The fields were stripped bare. The storehouses were completely emptied. And when the human civilization could no longer physically produce enough grain and livestock to satisfy the bottomless, raging appetite of the Nephilim, the giants turned violently, aggressively against their own creators. They began to aggressively devour the birds of the air, the beasts of the field, the reptiles, and the fish of the sea. They completely destroyed the delicate ecological balance of the earth. And when the animal kingdom was not enough to fill their massive stomachs, in the darkest, most terrifying escalation of their corrupted nature, they turned their terrifying, bloodthirsty attention directly toward humanity itself. According to the text, they began to systematically slaughter and consume human beings. They began to violently devour one another's flesh. They drank human blood. This was not merely a society that had lost its moral compass. According to the ancient traditions, this was a deeply catastrophic, planetary-level, ecological, and genetic crisis. The very DNA of the human race, the distinct, pristine biological lines of the animal kingdom, were being violently, aggressively polluted and hybridized by beings that possessed a dark, unholy combination of human cruelty and celestial power. The earth was no longer a beautiful, pristine sanctuary. It was a massive, enclosed, and inescapable nightmare. A bloody, horrific hunting ground ruled absolutely by violent, unstoppable, and deeply demonic hybrid giants. The physical world was completely consumed by extreme, unending violence and unnatural genetic pollution. The terrified, agonizing cries of the slaughtered, oppressed human race echoed up continuously from the blood-soaked dirt. The ancient text describes the broken souls of the dead screaming out for cosmic justice, their desperate, agonizing voices rising up through the heavy, smoke-filled air, beating furiously against the heavy gates of heaven. desperately pleading for immediate, catastrophic intervention against the absolute unchecked madness unfolding below. Colossal ruins scattered across the globe suddenly take on a much darker, terrifying context when viewed through the lens of this ancient text. Massive stone monoliths weighing thousands of tons. Advanced geometric knowledge that baffles modern engineering. Incredibly precise astronomical alignments carved into solid rock. History is completely silent on exactly who built them and how. But the Book of Enoch provides a terrifying alternative answer. A civilization built on the unauthorized architectural and mathematical secrets handed down by fallen angels. A civilization that grew too fast, too violently, and too arrogantly. And the response from the absolute highest authority in the universe was not going to be a simple reprimand. It was not going to be a localized punishment. It was going to be a massive, terrifying, and completely apocalyptic reset. Was the flood a cruel judgment, or was it a necessary, desperate intervention to save the human bloodline from total, irreversible genetic extinction? Was the flood a cruel, arbitrary judgment, or was it a necessary, desperate intervention to save the human bloodline from total, irreversible genetic extinction? According to the deeply unsettling narrative preserved in the Book of Enoch, the immense, unimaginable suffering of the human race did not go unnoticed in the celestial realms. The ancient text describes a profoundly dramatic and terrifying scene unfolding at the absolute highest levels of cosmic authority. The four great archangels of the celestial realm look down from their holy sanctuary: Michael, Uriel, Raphael, and Gabriel. We are culturally conditioned to imagine these beings as gentle guardians, winged messengers, or beautiful figures of comfort. But the ancient traditions paint a drastically different, profoundly heavier reality. They were the ultimate, terrifying military commanders of the cosmos. Beings of incomprehensible power, absolute justice, and unyielding order. When they looked down by the Watchers, they saw the massive by the Watchers. They saw the massive, bloodthirsty Nephilim tearing the fragile biological ecosystem apart. They saw humanity wielding the forbidden, destructive weapons introduced by Azazel, engaging in rampant, industrialized slaughter. The archangels gathered the desperate, broken cries of humanity. They brought the shattered, bleeding state of the earth directly before the throne of the Creator. They presented the undeniable evidence of a world entirely ruined by forbidden knowledge. They demanded a verdict. And the response from the highest cosmic authority was not a localized punishment. It was a massive, terrifying, and apocalyptic directive. The order was not merely to wash the earth. The order was to completely and violently excise the cosmic cancer that was rapidly consuming the planet. It was a surgical, catastrophic reset. The Book of Enoch details a chilling, highly coordinated military operation executed by the archangels. Before a single drop of rain fell from the darkened sky, the architects of the rebellion had to be systematically neutralized. Raphael was given a terrifying, highly specific command regarding Azazel, the fallen angel who had taught humanity the dark arts of metallurgy, warfare, and the manipulative weaponization of seduction. The text states that Raphael was ordered to bind Azazel hand and foot. He was not simply executed, he was violently dragged into the harsh, desolate, and unforgiving wasteland of a desert known as Dudal. There, a massive, deep, and jagged hole was torn into the earth. Azazel was cast down into the suffocating, lightless depths. Heavy, sharp, and jagged rocks were piled mercilessly upon him, completely burying the immortal entity in absolute, crushing darkness. He was commanded to remain there, paralyzed and blind, until the great day of final judgment, when the text explicitly states he will be cast permanently into the consuming fire. The sheer psychological terror of this ancient punishment is staggering. An immortal, celestial being of immense power and vast intellect, violently stripped of his cosmic authority, permanently locked in a dark, subterranean, sensory deprivation chamber, waiting in the cold silence of the earth for thousands of years. But the punishment did not end with Azazel. The supreme leader of the rebellion, Semyaza, and his dark lieutenants faced a uniquely horrifying, profoundly agonizing fate. Gabriel was dispatched not to bind them in the dark, but to execute a punishment that strikes at the very core of psychological devastation: the Nephilim, the towering, hybrid giants that the Watchers fiercely loved and desperately protected. According to the text, Gabriel was commanded to incite the giants aggressively against one another. He was to trigger a massive, uncontrollable civil war among the abominations. The Watchers were physically restrained and forced to stand by, completely powerless, as their massive, bloodthirsty children violently slaughtered each other in a catastrophic, earth-shaking conflict of mutual annihilation. The immortal fathers watched their unnatural offspring brutally tear themselves apart in the dust. They were forced to witness the total, screaming eradication of their entire earthly lineage. Only after the giants had completely fallen, only after their twisted legacy was violently erased before their very eyes, were Semyaza and his associates finally bound. According to the ancient traditions, the archangel Michael chained them fast in the deep, subterranean valleys of the earth, locking them away in highly secure, eternal holding cells for 70 generations, waiting in absolute terror for the final consummation of the universe. The spiritual and genetic architects of the corruption had been entirely neutralized. But the physical surface of the earth was still deeply, irreversibly polluted. The forbidden technology, the dark magic, the toxic heavy metals of advanced weaponry, and the genetic contamination remained heavily embedded in the soil. The entire architecture of the pre-flood world was fundamentally broken. It had to be entirely erased. Uriel was sent to a single specific man, the son of Lamech, a man named Noah. The biblical text in Genesis briefly notes that Noah was a righteous man, blameless among the people of his time. But when viewed through the dark, terrifying lens of the Book of Enoch, the word blameless takes on a profound, deeply biological significance. Noah was not just morally upright, he was genetically pristine. His specific bloodline had completely escaped the rampant, systemic hybridization of the Watchers. He was the absolute last, uncorrupted thread of the original human design. Uriel revealed the terrifying cosmic secret to Noah. The end of all flesh had been decreed. The earth was going to be completely, violently submerged. The Great Flood was not a petty act of divine anger. It was a strict, uncompromising planetary sterilization protocol. When the heavy, dark skies finally cracked open and the deep, subterranean fountains of the earth violently ruptured, the rising waters did not just drown wicked men. The crushing, unstoppable pressure of the global flood aggressively washed away the massive, unholy architecture of the giants. It buried the blazing iron forges of Azazel deep beneath millions of tons of heavy sediment. It permanently erased the dark, forbidden knowledge that had been illicitly downloaded into the human mind. The massive churning oceans functioned as an apocalyptic solvent, completely dissolving a corrupted world and violently pressing the reset button on the human timeline. When the heavy waters finally receded and the massive wooden ark rested securely on the silent, washed mountains of Ararat, the world was completely different. It was empty. It was quiet. It was safe. The divine order of the universe had been aggressively restored. The ultimate, unyielding limit of human knowledge had been violently re-established, but the memory of the terror remained. The deeply disturbing, highly detailed record of the Watchers, the Nephilim, and the forbidden knowledge survived the catastrophic deluge. According to ancient Jewish traditions, the terrifying history penned by Enoch was meticulously preserved. It was passed down quietly through the generations, a dark, heavy warning echoing through time. It served as a constant reminder to the descendants of Noah of exactly what happens when the absolute boundaries of the universe are arrogantly breached. For centuries, this profound, terrifying text held massive theological weight. It shaped the entire worldview of the ancient Jewish mystics. It heavily influenced the early writers of the New Testament. When the Christian movement began to actively, aggressively spread across the highly hostile Roman Empire in the 1st and 2nd centuries, the early believers did not view the Book of Enoch as a dangerous, heretical forgery. They viewed it as a crucial, foundational key to understanding the deep, structural origins of cosmic evil, the presence of wandering demonic spirits, and the ultimate, terrifying justice of God. Brilliant, highly revered early church fathers like Justin Martyr, Irenaeus, and Tertullian fiercely defended the text. They deeply relied on its terrifying narrative to logically explain the proliferation of dark magic and the absolute reality of demonic entities roaming the earth. They firmly believed that the pagan gods of the Greeks and Romans, the deities who constantly demanded blood sacrifices, were simply the lingering, disembodied spirits of the drowned Nephilim giants. The text was considered so incredibly authoritative that Jude, the half-brother of Jesus Christ, directly and unapologetically quoted a specific, heavy prophecy from the Book of Enoch in his own canonical epistle. For the first 3 centuries of the new faith, the forbidden history of the Watchers was widely accepted as the standard orthodox explanation for the extreme, unnatural corruption of the ancient world. But history is a long, highly political, and deeply complicated machine. As the early centuries slowly faded, the political and theological landscape of the ancient world began to drastically, heavily shift. The early church moved out of the dark, hunted shadows of the Roman catacombs, and stepped directly into the bright, highly structured, and heavily bureaucratic halls of absolute imperial power. Christianity rapidly transitioned into the official, dominant state religion of the massive Roman Empire. And with that immense, highly centralized political power came a deep, desperate need for absolute, rigid theological control. The massive, sprawling collection of ancient texts needed to be strictly categorized, heavily filtered, and officially standardized. Powerful bishops and highly educated theologians began to gather in massive, heavily guarded councils. They engaged in fierce, highly political debates about exactly which ancient texts would be universally elevated to the sacred canon, and which texts would be permanently, systematically excluded. And the Book of Enoch, with its incredibly vivid, deeply terrifying and highly complex cosmic narrative suddenly became a massive theological liability. The brilliant minds of the later church were heavily influenced by the structured, logical, and highly rational philosophy of ancient Greece. They were beginning to view angels strictly as purely spiritual, highly ethereal beings, entities composed entirely of light and pure intellect, beings completely devoid of physical mass, biological functions, or human passions. The Book of Enoch aggressively shattered that neat, comfortable, and highly sanitized philosophical box. According to the text, immortal, spiritual angels possess the physical capacity to descend to the earth, experience intense, blinding sexual lust, and biologically procreate with human women to produce massive physical offspring. To the highly educated, incredibly refined theological sensibilities of the 4th century church, the idea that celestial beings could experience physical desire and sire massive, bloodthirsty hybrid monsters was deeply, profoundly offensive. It was considered entirely too crude, too mythological. It sounded entirely too much like the chaotic, deeply pagan mythologies of Zeus and Hercules, rather than the orderly, highly structured theology of a perfect creator. Furthermore, the text presented a massive, deeply uncomfortable shift in the ultimate responsibility for human sin. The emerging Orthodox theology heavily emphasized the absolute, undeniable guilt of humanity. The fall in the Garden of Eden was the primary focal point for the entry of evil into the world. It was entirely the fault of human disobedience. But the Book of Enoch proposed a much darker, highly complex origin of systemic evil. It explicitly stated that humanity had been aggressively, artificially corrupted by the unauthorized, deliberate intervention of superior celestial beings. To the rigid theologians of the late Roman Empire, this narrative gave humanity far too much of an excuse. It shifted too much of the blame away from the human heart and placed it directly onto the shoulders of fallen angels. To aggressively combat the terrifying chaotic implications of the Book of Enoch, the later church authorities actively engineered a new, highly sanitized theological framework. Prominent, incredibly powerful theologians, most notably Saint Augustine of Hippo, began to actively, aggressively push back against the ancient, highly literal interpretation of the text. They actively developed and heavily promoted what is known historically as the Sethite view. They argued forcefully that the sons of God mentioned in Genesis were absolutely not fallen celestial angels. They claimed they were simply the righteous, entirely human descendants of Seth, and the daughters of men were simply the corrupted, entirely human descendants of Cain. Therefore, according to the later church councils, the tragic corruption of the ancient world was not caused by a terrifying cosmic invasion. It was merely a story of bad human marriages, a simple, easily explainable moral failure between rival human tribes. No rogue angels, no massive, towering hybrid giants, no unauthorized, highly destructive celestial technology. It was a neat, highly organized, and perfectly safe theological explanation. Because the Book of Enoch explicitly and loudly contradicted this new, safer theology, it immediately became a massive, highly dangerous threat to the established authority of the church councils. And so, the quiet, systematic purge began. There was no massive, highly dramatic public burning of the scrolls in the city squares. The erasure of the Book of Enoch was far more subtle and infinitely more effective. It was the slow, calculated, and deliberate bureaucratic suffocation of an idea. The text was systematically discredited. It was heavily denounced by powerful bishops who actively discouraged its reading in local congregations. When the highly influential lists of authoritative, canonical books were formally drawn up by heavy ecclesiastical authorities, the Book of Enoch was quietly, intentionally left off the list. It was aggressively categorized as apocryphal, a hidden thing, a text of dubious origin that was absolutely not fit for public reading. The highly skilled monks sitting in the quiet, candle-lit scriptoriums of the ancient monasteries were given strict, unwavering orders. Do not copy the Book of Enoch. In the ancient world, if a manuscript was not actively, meticulously copied by hand onto fresh parchment, it simply disintegrated. The fragile papyrus turned to dust. The ancient ink faded into nothingness. The slow, relentless march of time accomplished exactly what the censors desired. The text quietly, silently vanished from the libraries of Europe. The terrifying narrative of the Watchers, the forbidden technology, and the hybrid giants was completely erased from the theological consciousness of the Western world for over 1,000 years. But this massive, highly systematic historical erasure forces us to ask a deeply profound, heavily psychological question. A question that continues to fiercely divide historians, modern theologians, and millions of independent truth seekers across the globe today. When the powerful councils gathered behind heavy, closed doors to solidify the official canon of Scripture, were they merely protecting the flock from an ancient, fabricated, mythological fiction? Were they simply cleaning up the historical record and removing an unreliable text? Or were they terrified of the profound dark implications of what the text actually suggested about the true nature of evil, the extreme vulnerability of the human race, and the terrifying, highly permeable boundaries between our world and the unseen dimensions? Was it excluded because it was wrong? Or was it excluded because it was dangerous? Was the Book of Enoch excluded because it was a primitive historical fiction? Or was it meticulously, intentionally erased from the official canon of Scripture because the profound, sprawling implications of its message were considered deeply, fundamentally dangerous to the established, comfortable order of the growing empire? To fully grasp the massive, highly polarizing controversy surrounding this forbidden text, you must completely step away from the dusty academic debates of ancient Roman bishops. You must stop looking at the faded, crumbling parchment of the Dead Sea Scrolls. You must look directly into the psychological mirror it forcefully holds up to the human race. The true, underlying terror of this manuscript is not found in the towering, bloodthirsty Nephilim giants. It is not found in the vivid, apocalyptic descriptions of fallen angels bound in subterranean chains. Those are merely the symptoms of the collapse. The absolute core horror of Enoch is fundamentally about something far more insidious, far more pervasive, and profoundly relevant to the exact moment in history we are currently living in. The Book of Enoch is not about monsters. It is about boundaries. It is a deeply terrifying meditation on the absolute, unyielding limits of human knowledge. When the Watchers descended upon the freezing summit of Mount Hermon, their greatest, most unforgivable crime was not biological. It was technological and psychological. It was the unauthorized, highly aggressive acceleration of the human intellect. They handed the raw, unadulterated source code of the universe to a fragile species that possessed absolutely no moral framework to safely manage it. Azazel did not physically force humanity to forge heavy iron swords. He simply provided the forbidden metallurgical knowledge. The innate, dark aggression of the human heart immediately did the rest. The fallen angels introduced the complex arts of enchantment, the manipulation of roots, the mathematical reading of the stars, and the deadly manipulative vanity of seduction. They gave humanity the matches, fully knowing we were standing in a room soaked in highly flammable gasoline. The ancient text explicitly argues that humanity was never designed to hold the absolute power of the gods without the necessary spiritual maturity. The divine architecture of the cosmos dictates a strict, highly regulated natural progression, a slow, agonizing, but necessary maturation of the human soul. When that sacred progression is artificially, violently bypassed through the illicit acquisition of forbidden knowledge, the inevitable, catastrophic result is total, planetary self-destruction. The ancient human race became entirely drunk on its own sudden, massive technological supremacy. They believed they had completely conquered the natural world. They believed they were invincible, and they were completely, utterly wrong. The massive, crushing weight of the Great Flood was not an act of arbitrary divine malice. According to the ancient traditions, it was the heavy, unavoidable consequence of a civilization that had fundamentally broken the operational laws of its own existence. The human race had aggressively merged with the celestial. The biological had been irreparably polluted by the supernatural. The delicate, intended equilibrium of the earth was violently shattered, and the resulting chaos required a complete, devastating sterilization protocol to prevent the absolute extinction of the original human design. Now take a massive, highly analytical step forward in time. Leave the flooded, ruined landscapes of the ancient world behind. Look directly at the blazing, hyper-connected, and deeply technological era of the 21st century. Are we truly so different from the civilization described in those forbidden scrolls? Look at the astonishing, almost incomprehensible speed of our current technological acceleration. In slightly over a single century, we have transitioned from riding horses on dirt roads to splitting the fundamental atom, unleashing the terrifying, apocalyptic power of nuclear fire. We have completely mapped the complex, microscopic architecture of the human genome. We have granted ourselves the terrifying, unprecedented ability to actively edit, splice, and fundamentally alter the very biological code of life itself. We are actively creating highly complex, autonomous artificial intelligence systems that process information at speeds that entirely dwarf the capacity of the human brain. Systems that are rapidly, quietly evolving in ways even their own creators admit they cannot fully predict or absolutely control. We are standing on the precipice of a massive, unprecedented technological singularity. We are actively, aggressively reaching for the very powers of creation and destruction that were once exclusively reserved for the divine realm. We are not merely observing the universe. We are actively attempting to rewrite its source code. And just like the ancient generation described in the Book of Enoch, we possess an incredibly profound, deeply unsettling lack of moral maturity to safely wield this massive, godlike power. We forge incredible, highly advanced digital networks intended to connect the globe, only to watch them immediately weaponized to spread division, mass surveillance, and highly sophisticated psychological manipulation. We unlock the massive, clean energy of the atom and immediately construct stockpiles of highly devastating thermal weapons capable of turning the entire surface of the Earth into radioactive glass in a matter of minutes. We actively pursue the complex genetic hybridization of animal and human cells in sterile, highly secure laboratories. We are quietly pushing the absolute boundaries of what constitutes biological life. When we manipulate the very DNA that defines what it means to be human, are we not echoing the exact same unnatural, forbidden hybridization that birthed the Nephilim? Are we not attempting to manufacture our own highly engineered artificial giants? We are rapidly acquiring the forbidden knowledge of the Watchers. But this time, we do not need fallen angels to descend from the clouds to hand it to us. We are aggressively, relentlessly digging it up ourselves. The Book of Enoch is not a dusty, irrelevant relic of ancient mythology. It is a profound, deeply urgent, and terrifyingly precise psychological warning. It is a heavy, dark echo from a forgotten world that successfully managed to completely destroy itself through the arrogant acquisition of supreme knowledge. When the early church councils gathered behind closed doors to quietly, systematically erase this text from the official canon, they firmly believed they were protecting the fragile minds of the faithful from a chaotic, deeply pagan, and highly disturbing mythological fiction. They believed the story of rogue angels and massive, bloodthirsty giants was entirely too crude, too unbelievable, and too damaging to the strict, highly organized theology of the emerging Roman Empire. But perhaps in their rigid, highly bureaucratic pursuit of absolute theological order, they accidentally silenced the exact warning the human race desperately needed to hear. Perhaps the Book of Enoch was not excluded because its historical narrative was entirely false. Perhaps it was meticulously excluded because its underlying psychological truth was entirely too terrifying to confront. The text suggests that the greatest, most absolute threat to the survival of humanity is not a localized famine, a temporary political collapse, or a highly contagious disease. The greatest, most devastating threat to humanity is human arrogance combined with absolute, unchecked power. The manuscript survived the quiet, suffocating censorship of the Dark Ages. It survived the fierce, highly political, theological purges of the ancient world. It lay completely dormant, perfectly preserved in the isolated, freezing caves of the Judean desert and the high, remote mountains of Ethiopia, waiting patiently for thousands of years to be rediscovered. And there is a profoundly staggering, almost terrifying historical coincidence regarding the modern survival of this ancient warning. Look very closely at the timeline of human history. The absolute, undeniable, and universally recognized ancient Aramaic fragments of the text, the highly fragile Dead Sea Scrolls, were not discovered until the freezing winter of 1947. They sat perfectly preserved in absolute suffocating darkness, heavily sealed in clay jars, deep inside the desolate caves of Qumran for over 2 millennia. The greatest, most terrifying warning about the absolute dangers of forbidden technology and the catastrophic corruption of the human race was physically, miraculously unearthed from the desert sands at the exact same moment in human history that mankind successfully detonated the first atomic bombs. It emerged from the dark caves at the precise dawn of the nuclear and digital age, at the exact historical moment when humanity finally terrifyingly acquired the technological capacity to completely and violently destroy the entire planet? Was the sudden, miraculous archaeological resurrection of the Book of Enoch in the mid-20th century merely a random, incredibly fortunate stroke of historical luck? Or was it a deeply timed, highly orchestrated cosmic time capsule? A final, heavy, and desperate warning deliberately unsealed for a modern generation that is rapidly, blindly approaching the exact same terrifying precipice that completely doomed the ancient pre-flood world. The ancient, heavily weathered scrolls are now carefully preserved behind thick, heavily armored glass in modern, climate-controlled museums. The strange, deeply complex Aramaic letters have been meticulously translated, fiercely debated, and heavily analyzed by the brightest academic minds on the planet. The text is no longer hidden in the dark shadows of history. It is entirely accessible to anyone possessing the courage to actually read it. The Book of Enoch still exists. It is still read. It still fiercely provokes massive theological debate. And it still forces us to confront the exact same deeply terrifying question that has haunted the human race since the very dawn of conscious thought. What exactly happens when humanity aggressively, relentlessly reaches for a level of absolute knowledge and immense godlike power that it was never, ever meant to have? History, whether ancient, mythological, or modern, dictates an absolute, unbreakable law. When the fragile, corrupted human mind attempts to play the role of the creator, the inevitable, catastrophic result is the total destruction of the creation. The Watchers have long been bound in the deep, lightless valleys of the earth. The massive, towering Nephilim were completely washed away by the crushing, unstoppable pressure of the Great Flood. The ancient, corrupted world was violently erased from the physical map. But the dark, heavy shadow of their forbidden knowledge still lingers heavily in the air. The profound, deeply arrogant desire to completely transcend the absolute limits of human nature is still fiercely burning inside our collective DNA. We are rapidly, blindly building our own towering monuments of immense technological pride. We are forging our own highly advanced, deeply devastating versions of Azazel's iron swords. We are standing exactly on the edge of the very same precipice that completely swallowed the pre-flood world. The heavy, catastrophic price for aggressively crossing those boundaries has already been paid in full by a world that now lies completely buried beneath millions of tons of cold, silent sediment. They tried to hide the history. They tried to silence the warning. But the text survived. The Watchers are remembered. And the profound, terrifying truth of the forbidden world before the flood is finally, irreversibly stepping out of the shadows. If you want the next chapter in this dark, hidden history, if you want to explore the deepest, most terrifying ancient mysteries that the modern world is still desperately trying to comprehend, subscribe to the channel and tell me in the shadows of the comments below. Do you believe the Book of Enoch was excluded because it was a fabricated myth? Or was it hidden because the ancient authorities were terrified of the profound, dangerous truth it revealed about the absolute limits of human knowledge? What happens when humanity reaches for knowledge it was never meant to have? The truth is waiting in the dark.